Hello pre-calculus students, this is Mr. McAllen, and this video is a short video on how to find the trig ratios for quadrantal angles. Now this is different than any of the other angles we've been working with so far. These are the angles whose terminal sides land on the X or Y axis. They land on the quadrant lines, and that's where the word quadrantal angle comes from quadrant lines. So let's identify first what the quadrantal angles are. So I have drawn up here an XY axis or set of coordinate systems. So the first quadrantal angle is 0 degrees. Then we have 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 270 degrees, and then we're back at 360 degrees again. And we continue around adding by multiples of 90 to get our next quadrant line or quadrantal angle. So I'm going to just fill in the table here for theta to be 0 as our first one. Then I'll do this in red so that we're uniform. So 0 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 270 degrees, and 360 degrees, which is 0 degrees again. And if I went up to 450 degrees, that would be the 90 degree angle all over repeated again. So the first thing you need to remember is that these trig functions, they operate in patterns. They repeat themselves. They have a period of 360 degrees. So there's a way to remember this. For example, if you can remember that the sine of 0 degrees is equal to 0, then there's a progression that the sine ratio goes through. When it's at 0 degrees, the sine ratio is at 0, but when you go to 90, the sine ratio is at 1 because the angle is fully in the direction of the y-axis. That's for sine. As you go to 180, it's back to 0 again. And when you go to 270, it's at -1 because the sine, the y, the vector or the terminal side is fully aligned with the y-axis, but it's pointing in the downward direction. And then when you get back to 0, it's not aligned with the y-axis at all. It's completely all on the x-axis, so the sine ratio is 0. So it follows this progression. It goes from 0 to 1, from 0 to 1 to 0 to -1 to 0, and it repeats that pattern again. The cosine ratio is when sine is at 0, the cosine ratio is at 1 for starters, at 0 degrees. And then when you get to 90, the cosine ratio goes to 0. Then it goes down to -1. Then the cosine ratio at 270 is at 0 again. And then it returns back to its original value that it was at 0 degrees when it gets to 360 and is at 1 again. So we're hoping that you can guess from the pattern what the sine ratio would be and what the cosine ratio would be. So if you can just make a mental guess and take a moment to think about that, hopefully you're following the pattern and you see that it went from 0 to 1 to 0 to -1 to 0, its starting value again, and its next value for 450 would be the same that it was at 90. It's going to be at 1 again. So with that said, you should be able to pattern out and figure out all quadrantal angles for sine, all quadrantal angles for cosine. Cosine's value at 450 will be 0. And you should be able to use this information to find out what the tangent ratio is. Now, I'm going to use an identity. It's a well-known fact that maybe not to us yet, but the tangent ratio is equal to the sine ratio divided by the cosine ratio. That's an identity. It's called one of the first quotient identities for trigonometry. And later in the year, we're going to be studying more identities, but we're just going to use this one now to help us figure out what these quadrantal values will be. So if you take the tangent of 0, you're basically taking the 0 value for sine, and you're dividing it by the 1 value for cosine, and 0 divided by 1 is 0 over 1, which would be 0. So the tangent ratio is 0, and then in the next spot, you're taking 1 and you're dividing by 0. And anytime you divide by 0, you get an error, a domain error. So we're going to write undefined. Then for the next one, 0 divided by -1 is 0. And again, at 270, we're undefined because we're dividing by 0. And then the last one is going to be 0 divided by 1, so the ratio will be 0. So you can see there's a pattern here for tangent. It varies between 0 and undefined, and you need to really memorize how we came about with this table of information, because once you get this table set up, you can find the other 6 trig ratios. So I'm going to, in another color, I'm going to do the reciprocal relationship. For instance, a cosecant. Remember, it's the reciprocal of the sine ratio. Cosecant of 0 would be, when you do the reciprocal of 0, it's basically undefined because you're dividing by 0. The reciprocal of 1 is 1. The reciprocal of 0, again, is undefined. The reciprocal of -1 is -1 because you're just doing the reciprocal 1 over that number. And here, when you do 1 over 0, that's going to be also undefined. So as you can see here, cosecant has it's either undefined 1 or -1, but it's based on the reciprocal identity that cosecant is equal to 1 over the sine of theta. So what I'd like you to do is fill in what you think the answer is for the secant of theta, and fill in what you think the answer would be for the cotangent of theta. I'm going to pause the video, and when after a couple seconds, I'm going to come back and hopefully your answers will match mine. Okay, well, I'm back, and here we have the secant answers. Let's go over those first. The secant, when you do the reciprocal of 1, you get 1. When you get the reciprocal of 0, you get undefined because you're now dividing by 0. When you do the reciprocal of -1, you get -1. And then again, when you do the reciprocal of 0, it's undefined. And you can follow the rest of the pattern. Now, on tangent, when you do the reciprocal of 0, you get undefined. And when you do the reciprocal of undefined, you get 0 because you're taking what you were dividing by 0 before, and now 0 is in the numerator, and the number is in the denominator, so it divides and works. So you could follow the pattern here. So hopefully this has helped you figure out what the quadrantal angles are for all trig ratios. Remember, it all starts out with your ability to remember one thing. The sine of 0 degrees is equal to 0. If you can remember this one spot on the table, you can fill out all of these values by following a pattern. And if you remember the sine of 0 is 0, then you should know that the cosine of 0 is equal to 1, and you could fill out the remaining pattern for these angles. Once you get that established, you just have the tangent ratio is the sine divided by the cosine. And remember, whenever you divide by 0, it's undefined. And then you do all the reciprocal ratios for the other 3, just like we practiced in class. Hopefully this helps you understand how to work with quadrantal values and trig ratios, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Please fill out the answers to the form and to get full credit for the homework assignment.